I'm Uriah Heep, and this is my Literary Cafe. Welcome to the Great American Novel Series, brought to you by The Author's Matrix. And in this episode, we'll be looking at Chapter 16 of The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield, where our hero, Nigel, looks like he's going to the Science Symposium to have Addison's work known to the world. Let's find out what happens. Without further ado, Chapter 16 of The Village Idiot.
Chapter 16. Upon awakening, Nigel's acute sense of smell was assaulted by the stench of raw sewage that permeated the house. He gauged at first, and wished to rid himself of such a noxious odor, but without success. He dressed hurriedly and went down the darkened hallway into the kitchen. Much to his horror, he was greeted by his mum, who was in the midst of shoveling a mound of raw sewage into a large pot on the stove. "Your porridge will be ready soon, Nigel," Edith said with a smile. "I am preparing your favourite breakfast." Nigel stood breathless at the door, and no words could be called forth. His attention was swiftly diverted to the jug of fresh water he had brought home from the Highlands late last evening. As his mum was cooking his breakfast with raw sewage, it became evident to him that his parents had not drunk the pure water he had left in the jug upon his return. He raced across the kitchen, picked up the jug, turned to his mum and asked, "Mum, where is the water I left in this jug?" Jonah had just entered the kitchen, caught the tail end of Nigel's question, and knew full well what he had just asked his mum. "Oh, that," Jonah replied for his wife. "We tossed that yesterday afternoon. There was no reason to keep that jug of nothing around the house." "What do you mean tossed, father?" Nigel asked. "Well, Nigel," Jonah replied, "we have plenty of fresh sewer water flowing all day and night across the street. We are very fortunate indeed. There was no reason to have a perfectly useful jug with that nothing in it. It was a waste of space. I had your mum dispose of it." Nigel was stunned at the mingling of ignorance and arrogance he saw in his parents at that moment. Hadn't they heard a word he said yesterday? He felt foolish for believing that he had convinced them of anything as he spoke of Addison's work. This incident only made him more determined than ever to present the most critical knowledge in the world at the university's Science Symposium next semester. Indeed, his parents would be convinced if he could convince the world. There was no more conversation between Nigel and his parents that morning. While his mum was preparing that rancid breakfast and his father was immersed in reading his daily paper, Nigel edged over to the jug he brought home last night to assure himself that the water he had carried from the Highlands was still safely in it. Relieved, he quietly removed the jug from the kitchen where it was in peril and brought it to his room. He realized he needed to be more careful than ever to protect his water supply from his parents. After that morning, Nigel wisely never spoke of Addison Way and his research on the nature of water with his parents. He dutifully attended his classes at the university and excelled, garnering the praise of the entire science department. His work was twofold. He wished to distinguish himself as a scholar, which would prepare the way for his presentation at the Science Symposium in the spring. He felt that drawing the constant approbation of his professors through his scholarship would give him the credibility he would need to present at the symposium. His professors were dutifully impressed and encouraged him to enter the symposium with some original research. "This would be a great value to the university, Nigel," said Professor Umph at his quarterly meeting with Nigel. The professor took a great interest in his students and believed Nigel to be one of the brightest stars in the department. "Have you considered entering, Nigel?" the professor asked as he ceremoniously shuffled useless papers about his desk to give the appearance of being usefully busy. "Oh yes, indeed," replied Nigel. "I have been working throughout the semester in preparation for the symposium." "Capital!" exclaimed Professor Umph. "That is excellent news, Nigel. So you have a topic you wish to present to the committee for approval." "It is almost complete, Professor Umph," Nigel replied nervously. He had known since the germination of this idea that he would not be able to present the true nature of his presentation to the committee for their approval. If they knew he would be presenting on the nature of water, his topic would be soundly rejected. He reasoned he must be a bit devious, so he disguised the actual topic, merely hinting at it. "Can you give me a hint, Nigel?" Professor Umph said as he hunched over his massive desk and squinted. A wry smile crossed his lips as he awaited Nigel's answer. Nigel shuffled uneasily in his chair and could not help to notice the sore atop his professor's head had grown considerably this semester and was oozing a putrid odour that he noticed had now filled the room. This professor, Nigel thought to himself, had dedicated his professional life to the pursuit of knowledge, yet when it was most important to his very existence, preferred the conceit of his position at the university to see what was true about the world. "Well, Nigel," the professor pushed. "It has to do with the nature of the world around us, Professor," Nigel stated with an intentional vagueness. "Well, as a scientist, that is a vital topic, rest assured," Professor Umph replied. "However, you will have to sharpen the focus to pass muster with the committee. After all, you could lecture for years given that topic, and the symposium will only last 2 weeks," the professor said as he chortled out loud. "Yes, Professor," Nigel replied. "Of course. I am in the process of bringing my topic into a more accurate, defined focus. I shall have the final draft prepared to present to the committee by next week's deadline. Rest assured." As he repeated the professor's words, he felt that he was flattering the professor and was right. As Professor Umph smiled at Nigel, his rotten teeth made him feel ill. That grotesque figure sitting before him, decrepit beyond words, and the result of consuming raw sewage for all his life, made Nigel all the more determined to have Addison Way's life work known to the world. He was sure the upcoming Science Symposium was the perfect forum to have that be. Nigel has spent all his free time studying with him at Addison's lab in the Highlands. He had met the other students who were also immersed in the same study and found solace in knowing that there were other people he could meet and speak with who shared the same high opinion of Addison Way and valued his work tremendously. This was a great encouragement to him as the months passed until the Science Symposium in the spring. He did not choose to inform Addison of his plan to present the results of Addison's life work to the science community at the university. He knew of Addison's experience some 40 years ago and feared he would discourage Nigel's participation in such an event. He would wait until after the symposium, when the scientific community would logically rise in unity to praise his presentation, before telling Addison about it. "This will be the best gift I could give my dear friend, Addison," Nigel reasoned. "He will finally receive the accumulation and praise he so richly deserves, and I will bring this all about." Nigel worked diligently preparing his synopsis for the committee. He must be vague enough about his topic, but also say enough about what is true to receive the committee's blessing. On the morning in question, Nigel arrived at the university early. He spent an hour in the cafeteria drinking hot tea with the pure water he carried in a small container for his morning meal. Once his presentation topic was organized to his liking, he made his way to Professor Umph's office, where he would meet with the faculty members who would decide his fate, and he reasoned, the fate of mankind. "Enter, my friend." Professor Umph greeted Nigel, and the secretary ushered him into his office suite. "You are punctual as usual. Have a seat." Nigel sat down in the only chair available in the room and looked across Professor Umph's large oaken desk and saw 2 faculty members that he was unfamiliar with. The science department was large, but Nigel was surprised he did not recognize the other 2 professors. Professor Umph, once he successfully organized the voluminous papers scattered about his desk, introduced the 2 other professors. "Nigel," he began, "this is Professor Dudley and Professor Heap. I see the quizzical look on your face, Nigel, and yes, it is deserved." Nigel stared ahead. Professors Dudley and Heap are visiting professors from the University of London, Professor Umph explained. We here at the university wish to be inclusive and bring together the finest minds in the field of science. They have both graciously agreed to take leave of their duties and join us in judging our Science Symposium. Although somewhat surprised by the presence of the visiting professors, Nigel reasoned that having professors from a prestigious university in London judging the symposium could only help his case. This could be an excellent thing, Nigel thought to himself as he shook the grisly hands of the two visiting professors. They were both somewhat elderly, at least appeared so to Nigel. Professor Dudley was a man in his 50s, Nigel assumed, and was covered with oozing sores all over his body, at least the parts of his body that were visibly present. It was a grotesque reminder to Nigel of the sheer importance of having Addison's work known to the world. The other professor was quite a bit younger and not as damaged as the one sitting beside her. Nigel guessed Professor Heap was likely in her early 40s, yet her hair had already turned a yellowish grey and was unsightly in Nigel's eyes. He noticed that chunks had already fallen out, with no hope of restoration. As she withdrew her hand from Nigel, he could not help but notice that brownish knot on the back of her bony hand. He had never seen such a wound on an individual as that before, and he withdrew his hand rather quicker than expected in polite company. This withdrawal did not go unnoticed by Professor Heap, who swiftly withdrew her hand and hid her hideous, toothless grin, much to Nigel's relief. Now on to business, Professor Umph stated with much authority, stirring the present participants into order. You have your proposal, Nigel, I trust? Yes, indeed, sir, Nigel replied as he handed his document to the professor. While outwardly agreeable, Professor Umph knew quite well of Nigel's history with the study of water, and read over his proposal with scrutiny before passing it on to his colleagues for their perusal. He seemed satisfied that there was no direct mention of the nature of water, which is what he had feared. As the other professors traded Nigel's proposal, Professor Umph symbolically patted himself on the back, reasoning that the meeting with Professor Glasgow had dissuaded correctly one of his star pupils from ruining his academic career in a way that could only lead to perdition by following that lunatic's study of water. Nigel waited for the committee's response quietly and respectfully in his seat. The wait was not long as the three professors spoke in whispers for the better part of just 2 minutes. We have approved your topic, Nigel, Professor Umph declared, as both visiting professors smiled in unison. I must say that it is an intriguing topic, and he quoted, "The relation of self and world. How the self takes in the outside world in a variety of ways that both advances and retards his life." I must say, Nigel, the professor continued, that the title is a bit wordy. Perhaps you can edit it down just a bit before the symposium. Of course, Professor Umph, Nigel replied as he took back his proposal from Professor Heap's bony, decrepit hand stretched forth. I certainly will, sir. Good, Professor Umph declared and announced to all present that this meeting, successful as it was, is now adjourned. Nigel was never more hopeful for his life and the lives of everyone he loved and cherished in this world. He only had a few weeks to complete the final preparations for his presentation at the Science Symposium and worked feverishly to do so. Nigel continued his studies with Addison at his weekly lectures, but felt the need to inform him of the presentation he was preparing for the Science Symposium, but he did not. He reasoned that his keeping this presentation secret from Addison would only make the grand success of it ever sweeter for him. This will give my great friend and mentor the praise and glory he so richly deserves, Nigel thought as he left Addison's lab for the final time before the symposium. The day finally arrived, and Nigel arose before the sun to prepare his satchel for the walk to the university. While he retired early the previous evening, he did not sleep a wink. He tossed and turned, enveloped in an excitement that he had never experienced before in his lifetime. He reasoned that it was worth the lack of sleep, as he would be rewarded the next day as his presentation would meet unparalleled success, of which he was sure. Nigel arrived at the grand auditorium at the university and signed himself in at the door, which all presenters were required to do. He took his place in the front row and spent the next hour mingling with fellow student presenters. It was the most exciting hour of his life. As the auditorium filled, Nigel grew even more excited by the prospect of changing the world this morning. Soon enough, his wait was over, and Professor Umph appeared on the stage with the other prominent members of the science department, as well as the 2 visiting professors. As Nigel joined with the nearly 500 members of the audience applauding, the retinue gathered could not help but notice the abject, frightful health of every one of them displayed before the world. It was a grotesque sight, as anyone he had ever witnessed. He knew that the consumption of raw sewage water over the decades had crippled every one of their lives. Why could they not see this simple, logical fact? Nigel thought to himself as he gazed upward. How could mankind continue a practice that so obviously weakened all of their lives so terribly? He wondered. Surely, after my presentation, he reasoned, a light will go off in their collective minds, and they will see and welcome what is so dramatically and forcefully true about the whole world. After Professor Umph concluded his introductory remarks and introduced the panel of experts judging the participants, he indicated he would make a surprise announcement. The audience grew noticeably silent with excitement, eager to hear the professor's following words. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce the publisher of the Crumbly Village Times, also known as the paper of record in all the land, the esteemed publisher of such, one Lord Jake Holdsapfel. Amid the applause, Jake Holdsapfel joined the science department on stage and graciously accepted the crowd's plaudits. Jake was now in his 60s and looked like death warmed over. It was indeed a hideous sight. He had succeeded his father as publisher decades ago after his passing, and had also inherited the title of Lord. Nigel joined in the applause, not knowing anything about this gentleman on stage. As the crowd settled down, Professor Umph announced that the Crumbly Village Times would be running a feature article that would be run on the front page, all about the symposium, and would feature the most important scientific findings arising from the work of the university students presenting. The gathering in the auditorium burst into robust cheers and applause at the news, with Nigel standing up in the front row leading the cheers. Nigel was elated. The prospect of having his presentation splashed across the front page of the most essential paper in all the kingdom would only hasten this knowledge being known reasonably and sincerely worldwide. He tried to calm himself, as each presenter gone before him only drew him closer to his time. Finally, 2 hours into the presentations, Nigel was called up onto the stage by Professor Umph. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow faculty and esteemed guests, it gives me my greatest pleasure to introduce to all of you one Nigel Crumbly. Of course, you all recognize his surname, and he is one of the descendants of the founding father of the great village of Crumbly. This young scientist has carried on the family name in the most important traditions of our society. If I might add, he has shown brilliance in the field of science, and I predict he will make important discoveries in the years to come that will change the course of history. The audience applauded vigorously after Professor Umph's introduction. Nigel had always kept a low-key manner about him throughout his university career, so most of those gathered this morning for the symposium had never heard of him, making Professor Umph's introduction all the more dramatic. Nigel made his way to the presenter's podium in the middle of the stage and nervously placed his paper in front of him. He hesitated, some say, looking back on this fateful day, that his hesitation was planned for dramatic effect, but others have argued the opposite. Nevertheless, the gathering quieted down out of respect for the presenter, and Nigel began. Fellow classmates, esteemed faculty, and honoured guests, he began, it is the greatest privilege of my short life to stand before you and present to your knowledge what I carefully believe is the most important discovery in all of human history. A bit of hyperbole indeed. The visiting Professor Dudley leaned over and whispered into Professor Umph's unwilling ear. He ignored the statement and grew nervous. "I stand before you, a humble university student," Nigel continued, "as a budding scientist. We all know that the knowledge we benefit from today was garnered from the sacrifices and work of those who went before us. It is our duty to build on that knowledge and advance our species." Nigel paused for the polite applause he anticipated, but none was forthcoming. Greeting the stony silence, he continued after sipping the crystal clear, pure water in the sheer glass he had surreptitiously brought with him onto the stage. As he placed the glass back down on the podium, certain audience members noticed the water he had just sipped, and there was a murmuring amongst the gathered. This abject defiance by Nigel did not go unnoticed by the professors sitting behind him. Professor Umph strained his rather large neck to get a better look at that glass, but from his vantage point, a clear, unobstructed view was difficult to attain. Professor Heap, however, sitting to the far side of the line of professors, had a clear view of Nigel and his podium, and was aghast. Nigel continued, "It is that aesthetic relation of self and world that is the basis of our existence. The self, our very selves, are continually added to by the outside world. This is the future study of science, in my humble opinion." Professor Umph shuffled nervously in his seat. "As we welcome and take in various aspects of the outside world, air, food, colour, our very selves grow, and we become more ourselves through this beautiful addition," Nigel stated calmly yet emphatically. "Now, while we are added to in so many different ways by welcoming the outside world into ourselves, there are, logically, aspects of reality that would be harmful if one were to take it into us." Nigel explained to the gathering the various harm that would come to the self if it welcomed certain aspects of reality in a way that would hurt us. For instance, the audience hooted when he explained that one should not eat coal. "The coal that many of us use to furnish heat for our homes," he explained, "would not be a welcome addition to our diets." As the audience composed itself and the laughs died down from Nigel's remark, he reached for the glass of water again, but this time he did not take a sip to lubricate his throat. Instead, he held the glass of water before him for all the audience to see. "This is what I feared," exclaimed Professor Umph to himself under his breath. The two visiting professors sitting on either side of the professor heard his remark and glanced at each other, then at Professor Umph. Nigel would continue now, and he proceeded to explain in great scientific detail the actual life-giving value of fresh, pure water as represented by the glass held out for all to see. The nearly 500 gathered before he stirred, and sidebar conversations exploded, and the din it produced caused Nigel to pause reluctantly. He stood silently at his podium, and as the audience realized that his silence resulted from their collective rudeness, they quieted down just enough for him to recover and begin to speak again. Professor Umph wiped his ample brow of sweat mingled with a brown substance that constantly oozed from a large open sore on his forehead. "It is not I," Nigel continued, "that has come to this remarkable discovery about the nature of water and the deleterious effects from the consumption of raw sewage and the simultaneous life-affirming effects of consuming pure, clear water, but the greatest scientist of them all. A man whose humility knows no bounds, and who graced this very university some 4 decades ago. His name is Addison Way, and I am proud to state that he is my mentor and friend, and has taught me the most valuable lessons in my life." The damage was done. Nigel attempted to tell the true history of Addison Way and the university to the audience now embroiled in raucous conversation. They were oblivious to Professor Umph's manhandling of Nigel as he was ripped from the stage and forcibly removed from view. He resisted not, thankfully, for Professor Umph, as, given his health challenges, would have been no match for a college student given the fitness and robust health that Nigel enjoyed. The Science Symposium ended, and the audience was dismissed. Lord Jake Holzapfel remained on stage, stunned at the proceedings. He had not heard of his chum, Addison Way, all these decades and had assumed he had met an early death. Jake gingerly stood up, placed his cane in front of him, and exited the stage unnoticed by all. When Professor Umph finally released Nigel from his grip, he could not speak a word. His anger and hatred for someone he considered one of his prize pupils was palpable. Nigel did not attempt to flee from his professor's wrath, but remained stoically silent, waiting for him to speak first. He had already determined, as he was rushed off the stage, that he would not apologize or express any regret for his actions. He felt he was doing what humanity demanded. He knew in his heart that he had told the truth to the world that fateful day and was prepared for the consequences. The two visiting professors felt the humiliation that Professor Umph must have endured on that stage, and they both expressed their condolences in front of Nigel. Neither dared look Nigel in the eyes. Instead, they shunned him, ignoring him in obvious disdain as they spoke with Professor Umph. "You are a pariah, young man," Professor Heap finally said, as she brushed past Nigel. "You are a heretic, and a disgrace to all who attend this university. You have sullied the great name this institution has spent decades building up. Your shame should have no bounds." Nigel did not answer the cruel words of the visiting professor. He did notice, however, the apparent effects of consuming large amounts of raw sewage water over a lifetime. As Professor Heap crept away towards the exits, Nigel noticed the decided limp in her gait and the large stain that was gathering on her back, likely the result of a sore opening up. She was pathetic, Nigel thought to himself as his eyes followed her to the door, but he did not scorn her for her narrow, puerile mind and stunted intellect. Instead, he felt great pity for someone who had dedicated herself to the pursuit of knowledge and ending up a mere shell of her intellectual self. "You have disgraced this university beyond repair, I fear," bellowed Professor Umph. Nigel stood motionless and listened. "I will recommend immediate expulsion to the Dean this very afternoon." Nigel held his glass of water in his hand and took a sip. This action was taken as a direct insult to Professor Umph, and the temptation to slap the glass out of his student's hand was almost overwhelming. Still, he restrained himself just enough to avoid a battery charge. "You will meet me in my office this afternoon at tea time, Nigel," Professor Umph ordered, immediately leaving him alone in the back of the stage. The auditorium was empty and silent, affecting Nigel, who felt alone in the universe. There was no one to back him up. Nearly 500 classmates were present today, but none ventured to his side to validate his presentation and honor its importance. Nigel walked about the campus for the intervening hours before meeting with Professor Umph. When the time arrived and he walked into his professor's office, the secretary informed him that his meeting was postponed until the following day at the same hour. Nigel reasoned that Professor Umph wanted time to think over the lecture he was preparing to deliver to himself. Or worse, he tried to secure the commitment of the dean for his fate before the meeting. Nigel left the university and wandered about the village of Crumbly for the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening to avoid having to see his parents before they retired for the night. The following morning, he rose before the sun and made haste to be gone before his parents arose. When Jonah and Edith finally woke that morning, they were surprised to find their son had already left for the day. While hopeful that there was good news to be shared, they privately worried for Nigel. Jonah was the first to dress and follow his routine, which included retrieving the morning edition of the Crumbly Village Times from the front porch. Retrieving it, he did, and that innocent chore on that fateful morning hastened his descent to an early grave. As Edith prepared their breakfast, Jonah settled in his chair and opened the paper. The headline read, "Science Symposium Cancelled." Nervously, Jonah began to read the article but did not breathe a word of what he was reading to Edith. He held his breath as the import of the first paragraph struck him. He reread and reread that first paragraph, and each time, his heart sank further into an abyss he had never known before, and he began to weep. Edith was oblivious to her husband's suffering as she roasted sewage-laden pork on her stove. The stench of that culinary delight filled the room, but Jonah did not notice. Finally, seeking a brief respite from her cooking duties, Edith wheeled around and saw her husband slumped over the table, weeping uncontrollably, and she screamed. "Jonah! What troubles you so?" she implored as she raced to his side. Her embrace calmed Jonah momentarily, but the weeping continued in fits and starts. He could not speak. Instead, he slid the paper across the breakfast table and motioned to Edith to read it. Edith let go of her husband and carefully sat down, donned her reading glasses, and began scanning the article Jonah directed her to read. The headline shook her like it did her husband, but she remained calm and could read the first paragraph. Crumbly Village. The much-anticipated University Science Symposium was abruptly cancelled yesterday as heretical anti-science venom contaminated the proceedings, causing the university faculty to end the proceedings on its first day. The villain and purveyor of such filth was a university student, Mr. Nigel Crumbly, who presented his paper to the nearly 500 students and faculty on a subject that has been characterized as arising from the lunatic fringe of the scientific world. As his presentation began, Mr. Crumbly surreptitiously took a sip of what he described as pure, uncontaminated, crystal-clear water. This horrific slight to the science community had the effect of silencing the gathered masses. It was a well-planned and orchestrated insult to the greatest scientific minds that had gathered for the symposium from an upstart, ignorant child, stated Professor Umph of the University Science Department and chairman of the Science Symposium. After insulting the audience, Mr. Nigel Crumbly proceeded to go on this nonsensical rant about a long-forgotten pseudo-scientist of some 40 years ago, Mr. Addison Way, who was the first to propagate this disgraced, illiterate scientific theory that it is the raw sewer water humanity enjoys for all its needs, drinking, cooking, bathing, etc., that somehow harms the human self and stunts our very lives. Mr. Way was also an undergrad some decades ago when he pushed this discredited theory on the university community. This very paper, the Crumbly Village Times at the time, righteously dubbed this lunatic as the village idiot and exposed his anti-science lunacy to the world. It was thought that Mr. Way had perished alone and penniless decades ago. Still, it appears he remains alive and well enough to spread his hurtful theories that have infected one of the most promising science students at the university today. It is a shame to see such talent go horribly to waste. The university had informed the Crumbly Village Times that Mr. Nigel Crumbly would be expelled immediately before he could harm the university, its students, and its faculty more. Edith was speechless, but did not throw a fit like her husband. She remained calm and resolute and gently placed the newspaper back on the kitchen table. Composed, she got up and resumed her preparation of their morning meal. Her calmness in the face of such devastating news helped to bring Jonah around. He stopped weeping, wiped away his tears, and looked up at his wife. She did not acknowledge his return to calm, but went about her business nonplussed about the whole sordid affair. "Say something, Edith," Jonah implored. "Your indifferent silence hurts me." Edith scooped up the pork, laced with chunks of raw sewage, and made her way to the table. She calmly laid the fare before her husband and waited for him to serve himself. Jonah did not understand his wife's attitude at this moment, but he was hungry, and that desire trumped any further interest in discussing Nigel. So he dug into the putrid pile of pork and fecal matter and filled his plate. As the two ate in silence, finally, Edith spoke. "It is like this, Jonah," she began. "We have urged our son to accept what everyone knows to be true and not chase fanciful notions that society considers bizarre. He has disobeyed us and sullied our name in all of Crumbly Village. What can we do at this point?" There was no answer Jonah could offer up to his wife that would satisfy either of them, so he offered none. The damage has been done, Edith. I agree, Jonah replied. Our great name in this village will forever be known as that of a lunatic. I see no redemption here. Perhaps we could flee, Jonah, Edith offered as she munched on a rather large chunk of pork. Would we go to a different land and change our name? That is foolish, woman, Jonah said with anger rising. It is likely the whole world knows about us now. Damn! It was on the front page of the Crumbly Village Times. There is no place to hide. We are disgraced. The two of them went about their meal with no further discussion. Meanwhile, Nigel returned to the university in preparation for his meeting with Professor Umph that afternoon. He continued attending classes to further his education, but feared this might be his last time on a university campus. He was met with a stony silence in each class he attended that saturated the entire room. His fellow students looked away as he made his way to his seat, pretending that they were all too busy making preparations for the class. In truth, Nigel was being shunned by everyone. When he made a feeble attempt to garner the attention of a classmate, said classmate glanced at him, grimaced slightly, and turned their attention elsewhere. Finally, the hour had come, and Nigel found himself sitting across the massive oaken desk from his nemesis, Professor Umph. Strangely, the professor did not seem angry in the least. Instead, he greeted Nigel with a smile and a handshake, and offered him a seat. Sit, Nigel, Professor Umph urged without delay. I wish to speak with you about your presentation at the Science Symposium. I believe you have had sufficient time to consider your actions and the repercussions henceforth in the university community as well as our society at large. Yes, sir, Nigel said in a barely audible voice. And Nigel, the professor rejoined, what do you say now? Nigel was confused. He had expected to have been met by a screaming lunatic who would condemn him to eternal damnation for his actions. But the professor showed no such inclination. I presented what I know to be true, sir, Nigel stated. I have no reason to believe what I presented to the university is anything less than factual evidence of the nature of water, sir. That is so, Nigel, Professor Umph replied. It is what I expected you to say in your defense. Nothing more and nothing less. Nigel sat back in his chair, doubly confused now. There was no lecture to follow, he asked himself. There would be no condemnation or threats coming from the professor. He began to relax and surmised that perhaps his presentation had had some impact on Professor Umph after all, given that he had time to consider its merits. This idea seemed ludicrous to Nigel, but what explanation could explain Professor Umph's demeanour? I have spoken with my colleagues and the Dean about this most unfortunate matter, and we are all in agreement here, Professor Umph stated. This esteemed university believes rightly in the power of redemption. You are a bright, talented scholar. I do not use those words lightly. As you may know, our Dean Bug was a young dean at this university 40 years ago, when Addison Way was a student here. He was the one who was responsible for having him expelled, and rightly so. Addison was also known on campus as a brilliant young student, but unfortunately, his mind wandered off into some kind of fanciful wonderland of his own that ruined a most promising career. Given your relationship with him now, I am sure you know the history here. However, you likely only know the story from Addison Way's perspective, which, given his outlandish theories, is suspect at best and delusional at worst. I am afraid it is the worst I speak of now. Nigel shuffled nervously in his chair. He had expected a lecture filled with condemnation followed by an expulsion. Professor went on to denigrate Addison Way, making all sorts of outlandish accusations and backing none of them up with any verifiable facts. He went on for over an hour, and Nigel just sat there and listened. In summation, Nigel, Professor Umph concluded, it is the university's position that your career could not only be saved, but you could be held up to the entire community as a paragon of redemption and renewal. How so, Professor? Asked Nigel. I have spoken with the publisher of the Crumbly Village Times, one esteemed Lord Jake Holdsapfel, and he is very interested in publishing a follow-up article to the Science Symposium article that features yours truly. Nigel had not seen the article in question and could only imagine how harmful it was to science. Article, Professor? Nigel inquired. Oh yes, Nigel, Professor Umph rejoined. Here it is in all its gruesomeness. He snatched the paper off his credenza behind his desk and slid it across the oaken desk that divided them for Nigel's perusal. As Nigel read the same first paragraph his mum had read earlier in the day, he froze. Quite horrific, Nigel, Professor Umph offered. Nigel found himself seething underneath a veneer that belied his true feelings. He found the article utterly disgusting and disingenuous and stopped reading it after the first paragraph. Yes, Nigel, the professor continued. We at the university felt the same way as we read it. However, the glorious Crumbly Village Times is most interested in writing an article explaining how you had come under the spell of a charlatan and cult leader in Addison Way who led you astray. Once you realized that fully, you happily abandoned your nonsensical study of water and resumed your academic career here at the university and your promising science career. You will represent a tremendous example for future students. You will be heralded as somewhat of a hero and will once and for all banish this criminal, Mr. Addison Way, to the dustbin of scholarly history. Nigel was speechless and stared hopelessly into space. It was almost like he had not heard a word the professor uttered. But for now, Nigel, Professor Umph concluded, I would like you to take a week off your studies to ponder your future. Dean Bug has ordered you to be suspended from classes for the next week to clear your head and come to your senses. I think that this is a just resolution for all involved. I have alerted all your professors, who have generously agreed to provide their lessons for the week of your suspension, so you can keep up with your studies. Nigel left Professor Umph in a state of abject confusion. The university expected him to abandon everything he knew to be true in this world and conform to what he knew was abhorrent and false in the field of science. His reward for this would be reinstatement in the university and a career in science. He left the campus and made his way to the center of Crumbly Village, where he once again visited the monument to his ancestor. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Nigel, Jonah and Edith Crumbly had just arrived on campus, having arranged an appointment with Professor Umph regarding their son. Nigel would have been furious at this interference, but, fortunately, was ignorant of this meeting. As Jonah and Edith sat in the anterior waiting room before their meeting, they exchanged no words. They sat there in complete silence. After a brief waiting period, Professor Umph's secretary escorted them into his office and offered to make themselves comfortable, as Professor Umph was running late for their appointment. Finally, he arrived and greeted Mr. and Mrs. Crumbly most graciously, surprising the couple and garnering their gratitude. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Crumbly, Professor Umph began, what can I do for you today? The carefree, friendly attitude did not go unnoticed by Jonah and Edith. After what occurred at the Science Symposium, they expected a rather hostile welcome from the professor, their only son humiliated just a few days ago. Edith said, Well, Professor Umph, we are so grateful you condescended to grant us an audience this afternoon. The flattery was blatant and welcomed as Professor Umph, with a wave of his hand, acknowledged his guest's most deserved gratitude. Well, Professor, I took the time this morning to bake you some fresh brownies for your pleasure. Of course, I made them with the freshest raw sewage available, as Jonah and I have the great fortune to live right across the street from an open sewage trench that supplies our health and nutritional needs. Edith slid the tin box of brownies across the massive oaken desk toward Professor Umph. He accepted the gift with the utmost gratitude, thanking the desperate couple effusively. Try one, exclaimed Edith, and the professor gladly accepted her offer without any unnecessary delay on his part. As he reached for an enormous brownie in the tin box, a large chunk of fecal matter dropped off it and returned to the bottom of the box, only to be scooped up by the professor and placed back atop the brownie, thus securing its rightful place before he consumed it in a minimum of bites. "Quite good," exclaimed Professor Umph most emphatically. "As you can see, Professor," Edith continued while Professor Umph munched on his second brownie, "Jonah and I certainly disagree with our son's obsession with water. Aren't those brownies delicious, Professor? Have another one." Professor Umph heartedly agreed, even though he could not verbalize his agreement, as his mouth was still packed with the most recent fecal-laced brownie. But at the behest of Edith, he helped himself to a third. "We just hope, Professor," Edith continued unabated, "that the university will consider Nigel's youth and inexperience in these matters and allow him to continue his studies here at this magnificent university." A lone tear fell from Edith's eye as she completed her entreaty. Professor smiled at her with that grandfatherly look and assured her that the university had no such intention. After a thorough licking of his fingers, one at a time, post the last brownie the professor could force into his mouth, he smiled once again. "I have spoken with Dean Bug about Nigel's situation, and we both agreed it would be tragic to cut short such a promising scientific career of someone as gifted as your son, Mrs. Crumbly." Edith and Jonah's relief was palpable, and they both thanked Professor Umph for his generosity and goodwill. "This is wonderful, Professor Umph," Edith nearly screamed with delight. "I always knew that this proud institution would never let us down. I told Jonah on the way here this afternoon that I expected nothing less than the kindness you have shown us this day. How can we ever repay you, Professor?" "Perhaps some more of your fresh-baked brownies in raw sewage would be a fine start," the professor half joked. At the professor's last remark, the three gathered there in Professor Umph's office, and all chortled harmoniously and excessively for the better 2 minutes. "Mr. and Mrs. Crumbly," Professor Umph began in a more serious tone, "I met with Nigel earlier in the day regarding his performance at the Science Symposium." "Oh dear!" Edith yelped a bit louder than would be customarily appropriate in an office of such high repute. "It is quite all right, Mrs. Crumbly," the professor reassured the nervous couple before him. "The meeting went quite well. You see, Mr. and Mrs. Crumbly, the university's position is that Nigel has come under the undue influence of a former student from some 40 years ago, one Addison Way, who has almost forced your son against his will and subjugated him to his will. This charlatan crackpot, who disgraced this esteemed university decades ago with his lunatic fringe theories about the nature of water, has taken control of your son's mind and poisoned it." "Oh my!" screamed Edith. "Not to worry, Mrs. Crumbly," the professor continued as he puffed out his chest in a most impressive fashion. "Your son is bright enough to see the errors of his way. I have informed him that he must renounce this village idiot, as he is forever known, and tell the world about the cult he was lured into against his will. Dean Bug, I, and the entire science department will welcome him back into the university with the greatest pleasure." Edith and Jonah smiled, and Edith insisted Professor indulge himself in another one of her fresh brownies, which the professor did without hesitation.
Wow, the Science Symposium. That could have gone better. What a disaster. Now Nigel has a decision to make. Turn him against Addison Way and what he knows to be true, and continue his academic career. What a choice. Well, that's it for Chapter 16. Join us next time for Chapter 17 of The Village Idiot, and let's see what Nigel decides to do. So for now, good night, good luck, goodbye, and we'll see you next time.